therapy. Tonight, we are privileged to hear from BCBA Melinda Miller on what to do after you get an autism diagnosis. Melinda is a board certified behavior analyst who provides ABA therapy services to the South Suburbs of Chicago and surrounding area with her company, Momentum Behavior Services. Currently, she is working toward her PhD in ABA at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, and she is a research fellow with the Illinois LEND program. She is also the mother of 2 autistic children who have provided direction and purpose in her life. It is her goal to provide services to marginalized and underserved communities and enhance the quality of life of disabled persons and their families and caregivers. So I will turn the time over to Melinda.
Thank you, Kimmy. Hi, everyone. I am really excited to be
Melinda,
here
I don't think your audio's on.
Oh, can you hear me now? All right, awesome. Well, hi again.
Oh no, I can't hear you.
You can or cannot?
Oh, there we go. I gotcha.
Okay. Again, it wouldn't be a Zoom call if we didn't have some kind of technical difficulties, right? You know, so
how it goes.
All right. Okay. Can you see my screen here too? Can you see my screen, everybody? You can just like put in the chat. All right, Kimmy's giving me a thumbs up. Awesome. Awesome, awesome, awesome. So let me go to this slideshow here. I'm excited to be here with you all today, to have this time with you. Thank you for taking time out of your day to spend it with me. So I'm here to talk today and give this presentation. So you have an autism diagnosis. Now what? The purpose of this presentation, there's a couple of purposes really. Once you get a diagnosis, it can be extremely overwhelming. You really don't get a whole lot of direction as to what to do next or where to look or who to talk to. So I want to provide some guidance on how to sift through the information, as well as provide an introduction to various autism-related topics. Since our insurance is going to be covered in next week's virtual parent training, I'm not going to be going too in depth about insurance today. So definitely tune into that one. I probably will be there as well. So the agenda for today, Kimmy did a great job of introducing me, but I want to talk a little bit more about my journey with autism, cover the alphabet soup that comes along with a diagnosis, a little bit about getting organized, and I want to talk about care mapping and support systems and evidence-based practices. A user-friendly tip for this presentation is to grab a pen and paper and write down questions as we go along. There will be a Q&A at the end, but I really want to make sure that I get through the information today and then answer your questions at the end. And if for some reason, if you're not comfortable with sharing your question, feel free to email me or give me a call, and I'll put that information at the end of the PowerPoint slide as well. So let's get started. So about me, I am the mom of those 2 awesome kids there in that picture. It's my son and my daughter, whom I lovingly refer to as girl child and boy child. I am a BCBA, and I've worked with littles and bigs, so tiny humans and big humans, and everyone in between. I'm a doctoral student at the Chicago School. I'm also on the board of directors for the Illinois Association for Behavior Analysts, also known as ILABA, starting off with that alphabet soup today. And I've also worked as a special education teacher in a variety of environments. I've worked in a cooperative school as well as a therapeutic day school. And I'll talk a little bit more about those levels of supports in a couple of slides. I've also worked as a case manager for adults and as a developmental training program manager for adults with intellectual disabilities and mental illness. So a little bit about my journey with autism. The most important thing that I've learned from my journey is to keep moving forward. Some really, really great words from Martin Luther King Jr. and Walt Disney. A journey with any type of disability is not always linear, and I tried to make this as easy to follow as possible, but there was always bumps in the roads and sometimes a divergent path. So in May of 2006, my son was born, and I was so excited. I was a first-time parent. I was also really scared because having a child is a lot of responsibility. 2 years later, his sister was born. My daughter was born. We noticed some developmental delays with my son, but they weren't really prominent. We weren't really sure if it was a communication delay or if it was autism, but we did qualify for early intervention. So we started that in September of 2008. So when he was about 2.5 years old. About a year later, he had made progress with early intervention, and we started him in a general education preschool. I'm really grateful for the preschool teacher that he had. She came to me and we had a really good relationship, and she said, you know, I think he needs a little bit of extra support that I'm not able to provide. And she told me about screenings that the local school district does. So I took him and got him screened that following or in that Christmas break, and he qualified for special education services. So he started in a special education self-contained classroom in January of 2010. So at that time, he was 3.5. Later on that year, my daughter was diagnosed formally with autism spectrum disorder. Now, like I said, it's not exactly linear. So let me go back a little bit. I used to work with infants and toddlers, so I was really familiar with how the development of an infant and toddler went. And I remember bringing it up to her pediatrician and saying, you know, something's not quite right here. She's not looking, she's not listening to her name, she's not really developing motor skills the way that she's supposed to. And the doctor goes, don't worry, she'll grow out of it. We'll talk about it in 6 months. 6 months goes by, and I say again, I just don't think something's right here. She's not developing the way that she's supposed to be developing. And he goes, don't worry, she's a girl, she'll grow out of it, don't worry. He did that from the time she was 6 months old till she was 2.5. And I went, okay, I've had enough. And I went to University of Chicago, Comorbid Children's Hospital, and I met with a developmental, a pediatric developmental neurologist. Yes, it's a mouthful. And pretty much the doctor walked in and goes, yep, that's autism. And I went, great, now what do I do? And so that began my real journey into the world of autism. Since my son, so fast forward, my son is in the special education preschool. So I went to his preschool teacher and I said, hey, my daughter's going to turn 3 soon. She needs to come into the school, because when kids turn 3, they fall into the IEP category and they can be serviced by the school. And don't worry, we're going to talk about this in a little bit. So she started in special ed preschool when she turned 3. Within 2 weeks, they went, you know what? She has pretty severe needs and we can't really support that here. We want to send her to a different school. And I went, okay. And honestly, that was probably one of the best things that could have ever happened for her. She found a team that was on her side, that was ready to work with her. It was a smaller ratio of student to or teachers to students. And it's been a blessing. Back to boy child. The same year that she starts school, the same month actually, he got diagnosed with PDD-NOS. Now this diagnosis doesn't really exist anymore. PDD-NOS stands for Pervasive Developmental Disorder Not Otherwise Specified. And that falls underneath the autism umbrella now in the new categorization under the diagnostic criteria. So here we have a formal diagnosis for him. Awesome. We have supports that are in place for him. We know what's going on and we know how to proceed forward. A couple years later, since we had the right supports in place and he grew, he was able to be mainstreamed into the general education classroom. Awesome. It's what every parent dreams of, right? Oh my gosh, they're in general ed, they're doing great. Well, unfortunately, a couple of years later, he got bullied really badly. So badly, in fact, that we had to change school districts. Now, we went through the whole process. We talked to the teacher, talked to the principal, talked to the superintendent. Nothing happened. And thankfully, we were in a position that we could change districts for him. but it was a big problem, and it really affected how he performed in school and in his academics. And that hurts as a parent to see your child suffering. So we took what we needed to do, what we did, and we got him moved. And I know that we are very blessed to be able to do that, because not every parent is able to change districts. You have to fight the fight with that district. And it's really important that we come at things as advocates and not adversaries, because we're going to be working with these schools and these districts for a long period of time. So it's important to have a healthy working relationship with them from the beginning all the way up to when they graduate. Most recently, my daughter got another diagnosis of moderate intellectual disability on top of her autism diagnosis. Now, this is a really common thing for individuals with autism to have what's called comorbid diagnosis. And that means they have more than one diagnosis happening at the same time. For my son, it's autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, specific learning disability in math, and developmental coordination disorder. So he's got a lot of things going on. And then my daughter is ASD and moderate ID. So my journey's been up and down and all over the place. But the important thing is when you get this diagnosis, welcome to the party. It's so awesome to be a parent of a child with autism. I can't even tell you the number of celebrations that we've had over the successes that we've experienced that I don't know what it's like to be a parent of a neurotypical child. And I don't think I want to be, because this journey has been so rewarding. Has it been hard? Yeah. Has it been depressing at times? Yeah. But overall, it's been amazing. And it really teaches you resilience and appreciation and learning how to be a part of a team and support, not just for your kid, but for other parents that are going through the same exact journey that you are. So whether you're a new parent or you've had a diagnosis for a while, welcome to the party. So the first thing I really want to talk about is the alphabet soup that comes along with an ASD diagnosis. So in this particular section, we're going to cover ASD, Autism Spectrum Disorder, IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. I'll speak a little bit about the IFSP and IEP, Section 504, the ADA, what is SSI, and what is the PUNS. So let's get started. So what is ASD? Well, we know that ASD stands for Autism Spectrum Disorder. It's diagnosed by a licensed clinical psychologist or a medical doctor. In order to be diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, an individual must meet the DSM-5 criteria. Now, DSM stands for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So anytime a person has a diagnosis, ASD, ADHD, intellectual disability, bipolar disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, operational defiance disorder, they all meet specific criteria in this particular book. In order to be diagnosed with ASD, a doctor can use one of many instruments. So some of the assessments I have listed here are used in the diagnosis of autism. There's no one known cause to autism, but there's a lot of risk factors. And what risk factors means is that if these things are present, you're more likely to have autism. So some risk factors are genetic, like Fragile X or tuberous sclerosis or other genetic disorders. Down syndrome as well. If a sibling has ASD, so say your oldest child has ASD, the younger sibling is also likely to have ASD. Some prescription drugs taken during pregnancy are also a risk factor for ASD, and also children born to older parents are at risk of having autism spectrum disorder. It's important to know the current facts about ASD. Now, the current prevalence is that ASD occurs in 1 of every 54 children, and it's reported to occur in all racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic groups. This is a non-discriminatory diagnosis here. ASD is 4 times more likely or more common in boys than girls, and girls are likely to be diagnosed later than boys, typically because they show more inattentive features than more active features. So a diagnosis of ASD must have these things. So when you go to a doctor and you're looking for a diagnosis of ASD, or they say, hey, you have a diagnosis of ASD, what does that mean? Well, it means that the individual has persistent impairment in reciprocal social communication and social interaction. So that means conversation, joint attention, playing games, anything that has to do with any sort of social back and forth. They also must have restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. So that can be things that are like flapping their hands, lining things up, playing with things in a non-functional way. These things have to be present from early childhood, so from when they were little, so like infants and toddlers, and symptoms have to limit or impair everyday functioning. So the social communication piece, social interaction piece, restricted and repetitive behaviors have to prevent them from accessing their environment or their wants and their needs. Now, autism is a spectrum. And with this new DSM-5, there's 3 levels. So they'll say your child is ASD level 2. Okay, so what does that mean? They're not often explaining what the levels mean. So the levels have to do with the level of support that that individual requires. So a level 1 would be what we most commonly here refer to as high functioning. So they have some impairments, but they can get by with support. Those are the kiddos that we typically see mainstreamed or having like a job coach, or are able to do things more independently, but just with some supports. Level 2 means that they can do things, but they can do it with support. So they demonstrate rigidity and inflexibility and have more communication deficits and social deficits. Level 3 is where they require the most support. It's very substantial support. Now, this wording is taken straight from the DSM-5. So this is what they look at and what, when a doctor is diagnosing ASD and the levels that they're looking at. So very substantial support means that they have a really hard time with transitioning, a really hard time with plans changing, a really difficult time with social interactions. Like they are just kind of in their own world, so to speak, where they're not really engaging with anyone else and just, you know, engaging in things that make them happy in their own little world. So that's what the different levels refer to, is just how much support does an individual need? Do they need little support, some support, or a lot of support? Once you have a diagnosis, it's important to get an IDEA. An IDEA stands for Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Now, this is a federal law that's enforced by the Department of Education. It ensures special education and related services to students with disabilities. Related services means speech, occupational therapy, ABA, applied behavior analysis, physical therapy, social work. Those are considered related services. Now, there's 2 main parts to IDEA that you need to know. There's Part B, which is for children and youth aged 3 years to 21 years and 11 months. And those particular individuals get an IEP, which is an individualized education plan. I say 21 years to 11 months because once an individual turns 22, They don't qualify under IDEA anymore. They're in a whole different bracket. And adult services, I could do a whole nother session on adult services. I could do a whole nother session on IDEA as well. So, but this is just going to give an overview of what it is. So an IEP is for any child that is age 3 to 21 years, 11 months. Part C is for infants and toddlers, birth through 2 years, 11 months, because once they turn 3, they go to the education system. One really important thing to know about IDEA is that families must, I'm going to repeat, must be involved in the creation of the individual family service plan and the individual education plan. Families must be involved. So schools or providers cannot come up with this plan and enact this plan without your approval and without your involvement. IFSPs and IEPs are federal contracts for services. So if they say a child is supposed to receive 30 minutes of speech therapy a week, that's a contract for them to guarantee that you get that 30 minutes a week of speech. Okay, so that document makes sure that your child is getting the services that you agreed upon. There's 13 qualifying categories of IDEA, and ASD is on that list. Now, an individual can have multiple qualifying categories, like you can have ASD as well as intellectual disability, and that's okay. You can have multiple qualifying categories, and that's okay. The important thing is, for this conversation, is ASD is on that list as a qualifying category for services under IDEA. So in looking at this chart, we have a diagnosis of ASD. If your child is age 0 to 22 years, 11 months, you're going to go into early intervention and get the IFSP. In order to attain those services, if you're not referred by your doctor, or if your doctor's office has a social worker that helps you locate these facilities, you want to locate your local child and family connections, your local CFC. Those are the providers for early intervention services. There's also Head Start Early Childhood Education, which some programs have some for toddlers, and some of them start that at 3 years old. Now, if you have an individual that's aged 3 years to 21, 11 months, you're going to go into the education system. In the education system, you're going to have an IEP, and you're going to be serviced in one of those boxes underneath. What's important to know about the education system is that every single education system is required under IDEA to provide what's called a continuum of services. And the way to think of the continuum of services is actually by an upside down pyramid. And you're going to be, they're required to provide services in the least restrictive environment. So what that means is everybody starts in the big top box of general education. Everybody starts in general education. Then it tapers down to be more specific and more individualized. So you start off in general education, and say your individual needs just some supports, speech therapy, social work, like social group. They move down to the next tier, where they're still in general education, but just have some supports. Say they need a little bit more support. Then they move to the self-contained classroom. Self-contained classrooms are still located within a general education building, but just in its own room. Those students are still able to be mainstreamed for music, art, gym, recess, lunch, things like that. If an individual requires even more support, then they would go to what's called a cooperative. Now, my daughter attends a cooperative. A cooperative is a self-contained building that services multiple districts, and the ratios are small. There's generally a ratio of 1 staff to 3 students. Some of those students may have a 1-to-1. A side note on 1-to-1s. And a child can have a 1-to-1 in any part of this continuum. It's not just required for severe behavioral needs. You can have a 1-to-1 in a gen ed environment, generated with supports, or self-contained classroom. So a cooperative is going to have the lower ratio. Say you need even more support. You have therapeutic day school. Therapeutic day schools, like cooperatives, service many districts, many towns, and generally in a therapeutic day school setting, each child has a one-to-one as well as the staff and related service staff. If an individual is requiring even more supports than that, then they will be serviced in a home or hospital. So that is just the general overview of what a continuum of services look like. And your individual can fall in any one of those. So like for instance, my son started off in a self-contained classroom and eventually was mainstreamed. Right now, he's in high school and he receives some supports. So he's in that like second tier. And my daughter is in a cooperative. So it just depends on what the needs are, where and what makes sense for your learner to access academics and related services. Another thing that's important to know about is Section 504. Section 504 is a federal law like IDEA. However, it's enforced by the Office of Civil Rights as opposed to the Department of Education. Section 504 protects the rights of individuals with disabilities in programs and activities that receive federal financial assistance from the department. That means schools. 504 ensures that students with disabilities are provided educational services designed to meet the individual needs to the same degree as students without disabilities. So this means accommodations to the environment, instruction, and presentation of the curriculum. One key difference between IDEA and 504 is that families are not required to participate in the planning like an IFSP or an IEP. So the school can get together and create a 504 plan without parent input. So that's something to keep in mind. You don't have as many rights and procedural safeguards with a 504 as you do with an IEP. Now, a question I get a lot is, can a student have both a 504 and an IEP? It's a really good question. An IEP encompasses everything that a 504 has, but a 504 does not encompass everything that's in an IEP. So you may have an IEP with 504 accommodations and modifications, but a 504 will not have the academic components that an IEP does. A 504 just looks at accessing the environment. So, and it can be temporary. So say for instance, you have a student with diabetes. They may have a 504 plan, but not an IEP. Or say they break their leg and they need extra time to get to class. They would have a 504, but not an IEP. So just a little differences there. Another important thing to know is the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. This is another federal law that's enforced by the Office of Civil Rights, just like Section 504. Now, the ADA extends protection against discrimination. Now, and this is regardless of whether they receive any federal financial assistance. So IDEA and 504 are contingent on receiving federal funds. ADA is not. The ADA covers things like employment, program accessibility, communications, compliance, personal devices, service animals, and more. So the ADA looks at, can a person access the school? Can they get into the building? And 504 and IEPs look at what happens once they're inside the building. Another question I get a lot is, what is SSI? SSI means Supplemental Security Income. This is a federal income supplement program that's funded by general tax revenues, and this is designed to help aged, blind, and disabled individuals who have little to no income, and it provides cash to meet basic needs for food, clothing, and shelter. Now, this is something that is super helpful to look into if your individual causes a family member to not work. So a family member is dedicated to taking care of an individual and you need income to help provide for that individual in your family, look into SSI. I put a link there so you can look more into it. Your school social workers should know more about SSI as well and help with that process and what you can do to get on SSI. It is also, it's an income-based program. So there are some stipulations as to like how much a family can make and how much income they have and their assets in order to access SSI. What is the PUNS? I'm sure this is something that you've heard. What is the PUNS? Or maybe you never heard of the PUNS. The PUNS is something that is really important to know about. PUNS stands for the prioritization for urgency of need for services. Now you can enroll in this at any time. And in order to enroll and get onto the PUNS list, you need to do that with an independent service coordination agent, an ISC for short. This is for children, teens, and adults with developmental disabilities who need services or supports. What's important to know is the PUNS, being on the PUNS list, doesn't get you access to the services. It's a waiting list to get services. So you're on the PUNS list and waiting to get pulled to get access to the services from the government. So things like home-based services, supported employment, residential living arrangements. So community integrated living arrangements, or SILAs, or group homes as they're known as, adaptive equipment, other supports. There are a variety of programs that are available through the government, but in order to access those, you have to be on the PUNS list. If you're not on the PUNS list, there's no potential for you to get pulled to get access to those government funded programs. So enroll as soon as possible. And something to know about the great state of Illinois is that the waiting list for services is over 17 years. There are some people who have been waiting decades for services. So when I say enroll now, enroll now. We enrolled my daughter when she was 4, and you renew every year. So your ISC agent will contact you. You just sign a piece of paper and say, yes, I'm still interested. Yes, I still want services. And then you stay on the list and hope you get pulled. So if you want to know more about PUNS, you can contact your local ISC agent. I put some of them here. I'm from the South Suburbs of Chicago, so I put some in the surrounding area. If you're from outside the area or outside of Illinois, I'm not familiar with those programs are and what they look like in your state. I just know about Illinois, but contact your local ISC agent so that you can get yourself on the PUNS list. And this will come in handy too once your individual graduates and you need access to those adult services. You've already been on the list and you're one step closer. Okay, so that was a lot of information. So what do? You get organized. Start a binder. I have a binder for each one of my kids, and they have multiple tabs. There's medical records and educational records. For both of them, I have communication logs, and I'm going to give a sample of what that looks like in the next slide. So communication logs are super important because they tell you the history of conversations you've had with people and what it's been about. As far as medical records go, hang on to evaluations and diagnostic information because you're going to need that if you want to get any sort of services that are paid for by insurance. Keep vaccination records, dental records, because those are going to be required by the school. Any ER and urgent care visits, hospital stays, and any treatment plans from your services. Hang on to those. Treatment plans show what progress, if any, has been made over a certain period of time, generally 6 months. Educational records, the things you want to hang on to here are you'll get an initial evaluation, progress reports, report cards, which can be quarterly, trimesters, semesters, just depends on what your school district does. your yearly IFSP or IEP. You're also required to do a 3-year reevaluation. Now, the school does this. You're not responsible for doing this independently. This is something that's done by the school every 3 years. And hang on to transition plans. Transition plans under IDEA are required to be to start at age 16, but in Illinois, we are required to do that at age 14. And with transition plans, the child is required to be a part of that transition planning process. So that's something to know too. This is just an example of a communication log. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but I always like to keep track of date and time, the mode, so phone, email, face-to-face, who I talked to, what did we talk about, and what are the action items so I can follow up on that later. I want to talk a little bit about care mapping and support systems. So what is a care map? Well, a care map is a process that guides and supports the ability of families and care professionals to work together to achieve the best possible health outcomes. It's family-driven, it's person-centered, it highlights a family's strengths, and it communicates both the big picture and small details. I absolutely love doing a care map. It tells you so much information and I love it. So let me talk more about it. So how do you make a care map? Well, you start with a blank piece of paper and a pencil, or you can use a pen, but have a bunch of colors if you want. Draw a circle in the middle, and that represents your individual. Drawing the ring around the individual depicts the family. Then, coming from the center, you want to depict individuals or organizations that are a part of your child's team. And you want to keep these in broad categories. In the example I have here, I have caregivers, school, and social. The nice thing is you don't have to worry about getting this 100% right. You're probably going to go through a couple of versions of this until you get everything on your care map and everything covered. The next step is adding the supports. So here, the caregivers, we have Nana and Papa, Mrs. D, respite workers. For school, we have all of the support team. For social, we have like special rec, swim team, social group. So you're going to add the supports and fill up the page. I like to use one color per grouping because it makes it a little bit easier to identify the different parts. Once you've got your care map out, use different colors or shapes or symbols to identify barriers, supports, or unmet needs. So I didn't initially include medical or transition. Oh, okay, I gotta add those next. So I put that in black. But of course, this will look different for whenever you do your care map. Once you have your care map completed, share with trusted members of your child's team. So this would be your doctor, your teachers, your caregivers, and maybe they can help address any deficits that you found, or maybe you forgot something and they can help flesh out your supports. You can use a photo in the center of your individual in the center just to make it a little bit more fun. You can also include your individual. I think it's really great to include the individual when you can, because they may find some supports that you didn't even know they had. Maybe there's a kid at school that they're really good friends with, or maybe another teacher or support staff that interacts with them regularly that you didn't know. So involving the individual in making the care map is really helpful. Let me go back here. So doing a care map will really help you see, wow, I have a lot of supports. Or you can even find maybe, you know what, I'm kind of double dipping in some areas. Maybe we can combine that and make that into one thing. So a care map is really going to show you where your strengths are and where your opportunity for supports lie. Support systems are made up of so many different people from so many different places. It's family, friends, therapists, teachers, respite workers, organizations, and more. Support is everywhere. So what is respite or respite, however you want to say it? I get asked this a lot. Respite is a short-term relief for primary caregivers. It can be for an afternoon, several days, several weeks. It can be provided in the home, in a healthcare facility, or adult day center. And it's for any age, literally any age. You can have 2.5 to 20.5 to 6D.5, and that's okay. Respite is for everyone. And I put the number of a local provider of respite here on this slide for you as well. When you're looking for organizations to join and support, here are a couple of tips. Look for organizations that are nonprofits, that are person-centered, that don't look for cures. You want to include autistic individuals and other disabled individuals, and you want organizations that aim to empower and enable autistic or disabled individuals, parents, and caregivers. Here's a list of some organizations to join and follow. I included one that you might already know about. Last, I'd like to talk about evidence-based practices. What is evidence-based practice? Well, evidence-based practice is a practice that has to be rigorously evaluated through experimental evaluations. Evidence-based practices are shown to make a positive, statistically significant difference in important outcomes. They're typically done in well-designed studies, and they're used to make decisions about a client's care. Evidence-based practices also eliminate unsound or outdated practices, so you're using what's most current and most effective. I want to take a second to talk about non-evidence-based practices. These are some things that are advertised to cure autism. And I just want to talk about what the evidence actually shows. So one of these things is chelation therapy. Now, chelation therapy is an effective treatment for poisoning from lead, mercury, and other materials. But there's no medical or peer-reviewed literature for chelation therapy in regards to the treatment of autism. Hyperbaric oxygen therapy is a treatment that is effective for conditions related to oxygen in the blood, but the FDA has actually published warnings against this as a treatment for ASD. And lastly, facilitated communication, also known as supported typing. What's important about this is that the research has shown that facilitated communication produces what's called the ideomotor effect, which means the facilitator subconsciously influences the motor behavior of the individual. So it's not the individual actively and independently engaging in that behavior, it's being affected by the person who's facilitating that communication. But on the bright side, there's a lot of evidence-based practices and evidence-based therapies. So let's talk about a couple of them. So there's ABA, which is Applied Behavior Analysis, which addresses socially significant behaviors that increase an individual's independence and autonomy. There's developmental therapy, which uses play for global development and used in early intervention. Early intervention is the umbrella that a lot of these services fall under. It's services and supports available to babies and young children with developmental delays and disabilities. Occupational therapy develops, improves, as well as maintains the skills for daily living. Physical therapy improves movement, manages pain, and plays an important role in preventative care, rehabilitation, and treatment of chronic conditions, illnesses, or injuries. And speech-language pathology, which treats problems with speaking, language, and swallowing. And these therapies, ABA, DT, OT, PT, and speech, are sometimes SLP or ST, all utilize evidence-based practices. And I'm just going to tell you about a couple of them. So some evidence-based practices are the PECS, Picture Exchange Communication System, which is when learners are taught to communicate by giving a picture of a desired item to a communication partner in exchange for an item requested. There's also task analysis, which is when the activity or behavior is broken down into small steps. There's reinforcement, which is when a response after the learner engages in a desired behavior that results in increased occurrence that the behavior occurs again in the future. This is actually a basic principle of ABA. We also have visual supports, and visual supports can be any types of things: pictures, written words, objects, schedules, maps, etc. Social narratives, which are also known as social stories, typically are social situations that explain what's going to happen and what's expected. And antecedent-based interventions, which is arranging circumstances that precede the occurrence of a problem behavior in an effort to decrease it. So in summary, everyone's journey is unique, and it's not always linear. Don't be afraid to pick apart the alphabet soup, and don't be afraid to ask what something means. Make sure you get organized and hang on to everything. Use care mapping to determine your support strengths and areas of opportunities. Build your community. And there is a lot out there, but it's not all evidence-based. So make sure that you're doing your research on all of your the stuff that's coming at you to make sure that you're utilizing what's most current and what's most up to date. So thank you so much for spending time with me today. This is my contact information. So if you have any questions that are not answered, please feel free to reach out to me. But right now we'll do some Q&A.